Welcome back, WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and WNST.net. As part of, my continuing promise to write good things for you, a Dear Joe Flacco letter is available at WNST.net. You'll also hear it here on WNST and AM 1570, as well as out in our buyatoyota.com audio vault. Luke, all of the Ravens changes here, and we sat at the Earl Thomas press conference together on Thursday, and we got a new running back in Mark Ingram, who seems like a high-character guy, and two guys they've brought into the building who are very good football players from other places where they had very good football programs in New Orleans and in Seattle, and the departures of Weddle and Suggs and Flacco in front of the Broncos logo. So let's start outside the organization, and I wrote a Dear Joe Flacco letter, but I know you haven't gotten your 2 cents in on the backside of the Broncos press conference, but a little weird, dude. A little weird. You got to admit, right?
Yeah, it's definitely weird seeing, specifically Joe Flacco and Terrell Suggs. C.J. Mosley and Zadarius Smith and Eric Weddle. These are individuals who certainly there was fondness for, and in the case of Mosley, was a 4-time Pro Bowl player, but Flacco and Suggs, Suggs, you're talking 16 years. Flacco, you're talking over a decade. These are longtime Ravens who did some really special things in this organization, and to see them elsewhere talking about the Ravens in the past tense, it's definitely, it's different. It's something that takes some getting used to, and I think, and I didn't get a chance to watch the entire Flacco press conference, but certainly was following it and saw some of the quotes, saw some of the comments, saw some of the reaction to things he said. But, he acknowledged what I think everyone knew. The last couple months of his time with the Ravens was pretty miserable for him, being on the sideline and knowing that he wasn't going to be back, knowing that his time had passed as the Ravens' starting quarterback. Now, whether that proves to be the right decision or not over the long haul, that's going to depend on Lamar Jackson. But I think it was definitely weird seeing Joe Flacco holding a Broncos helmet.
Yeah, I'm going through my whole lifetime, right, of weird things like that, like the Messina Yankees press conference, right? Like, that's the Cal Ripken press conference we never had. That's the Ray Lewis press conference and John Ogden press conference and Jim Palmer and Brooks Robinson press. We never had any of those, right? So, in the era of the Albert Bells and the Roberto Alomars and in the era of the Vinny Testaverdes and whomever else you would pick, right? Even when Rod Woodson and Shannon Sharp showed up here, right? A little weird in the beginning. I think it's these long-term, punches, you know what I mean? The Messina thing on the baseball side, that was really weird, man. And the Flacco thing, Suggs to Arizona, not so much for me. I always sort of envisioned him going to the Cardinals, I was sort of shocked he didn't the last couple times around when he had the opportunity, but now he feels like, I always felt like at the end he would go out there and play if he had anything left, that they didn't want him around here. And I didn't realize how much belly he would have to want to play until he was 40. He's made a lot of money, you know what I mean? Like, he really loves football. It's very obvious to be doing it at this point. I don't know that I ever doubted that, but I always envisioned him in Arizona Cardinals. The rest of it, everything's felt so transactional, right? Whether it was Todd Heap going out to Arizona and playing, or Kelly Gregg, or name those players. But Johnny Yu with the San Diego Chargers. Flacco's going to play a long time in Denver. I think he's going to be there 2, 3, 4. I think he's going to start 50 or 60 games there. That's my feeling.
Okay. I'm not nearly as convinced of that, but it'll certainly be interesting. I'm certainly rooting for him to have that kind of a run in Denver. I don't want it to be a one-and-done situation, and then, heaven forbid, a year or two from now, Joe Flacco's looking to be a backup somewhere. That's kind of where this thing goes. If it doesn't work out for you in stop number 2, stop 3,
you go quarterback the Dolphins. Just ask Ryan Fitzpatrick. He'll tell you.
Right. But it definitely is a case where you get your second chance somewhere, and then if it doesn't work out there, then he's looking at a situation where he might have to compete, or he might be a backup behind a younger guy, and you're waiting for the younger guy to potentially stub his toe, like what happened with Kurt Warner behind Leinart in Arizona years ago. But it's definitely different, and it's definitely it's weird for me because for me, I mean, I kind of made my peace with Joe Flacco being gone by
last
the end of
April.
Last season. Well, I mean, kind of last April because you don't draft a quarterback in the first round with designs of him not replacing your longtime starter. But really, by the end of the season, when it was very obvious, I mean, one of the first things John Harbaugh talked about after the playoff loss to the Chargers was that Joe Flacco would be moving on. I mean, they didn't even try to be coy. Not that anyone wouldn't have seen right through it anyway if they had tried to be non-committal about it. But I think this was just the sense of it becoming official, seeing the farewell video, seeing Flacco next to John Elway, talking about the Broncos, talking about playing somewhere different, talking about even just the adjustment of joining a new team. And I think he was asked about Peyton Manning coming in and joining the Broncos, and Joe even said maybe that he's someone I should reach out to and talk to, and I think that would be a good idea for Joe to do that and get some advice from one of the greatest of all time who was in that same position going to that exact same franchise in a sense of people wondering if your career's over, people wondering if you have any good football left ahead of you. A little different for Flacco compared to Peyton Manning coming off of neck surgeries, but it's definitely a fresh start for him, and I'm rooting for him to do well. I'd certainly like to see that, not at the expense of the Ravens, but I think Flacco should be motivated to show that he's far from done, that he still has another 3 or 4 good years in him, and he's going to get a chance to prove that. Now, that said, I still wouldn't be surprised to see the Broncos draft a quarterback next month, and if that's the case, then Joe's going to be in a very similar position to what he was in Baltimore this past year, where he is really going to have to play at a high level and stay healthy and stay on the field to keep a rookie at bay and make him wait his turn, so to speak. So it's going to be interesting in that regard. And again, I think everyone here in Baltimore, knowing how unique the perception is. I mean, everywhere outside of Baltimore, Flacco's a punchline in many circles for being overpaid and not being all that good, and you're just hearing all the different things that people say.
Well, that was part of my Dear Joe Flacco letter that I wrote, which is sort of like you get a lot of money and you're not well regarded for being a Super Bowl MVP.
Sure.
And you're not Mark Rippon for crying out loud. I mean, you made the playoffs. You won a lot of games. You put the ball in Lee Evans' hands. You had Brady beaten up there 2 years after the Super Bowl, and the defense fell apart. I mean, there's been all sorts of things that went on that would have portrayed him 2 Super Bowls, 2 Super Bowl wins. I mean, what would he have needed to have done in that era to be perceived in that way? But it's all come unraveled after the knee injury. And quite frankly, as you've pointed out and written many times, not to make excuses for him, but they did not give him the pieces to make him successful here. And he was not successful here the way he wanted to be. But it wasn't because of his intellect or his arm or his arm strength or any of that. And I think when you do the things to protect him that Denver clearly would like to do around him, get a running game, get a passing game, get a defense, not going to have a kicker better than he has here, but he does have thin air. I don't see any reason why Joe Flacco can't win 9, 10, 11 games in Denver.
Yeah, I mean, so much of it's going to depend on what they are able to put around him. I think if the last 5 or 6 years showed us anything, it's that he can't do it by himself. And very, very, very few quarterbacks in the history of the game are able to do it by themselves. So, I mean,
how much better a quarterback was he on September 1st than Lamar Jackson was? I mean, you were out there, you're watching practice, you were out there all last summer getting a tan. It would have been laughable, right? Like literally for the first 6 weeks of the year, watching Flacco play and throw the ball and do it. It would have been on October 5th to say he's washed up. That's just ludicrous. And then he got hurt. He's literally never stood under center since then. Like, so to say he's washed up or can't play or not worth or isn't an NFL starter, you can't win games with him. I just think it's sort of weird that there's a perception that he's like bow-legged Johnny U going out to San Diego in some circles, or that his career is a joke. I think he's got plenty of football left because he's pissed off, quite frankly. I think they're going to get the best of him out there. I think I saw that last week. I saw a little fire in the belly. I would not be shocked for him to go out there and play 2 or 3 years of 8, 9, 10, 11 win football. Not go out there and stink and be 1-6 and have whomever they draft playing in his place. Unless there's just no talent there, and I'm overestimating what John Elway's worth, right?
Well, I mean, you have to look at what's going to be around him out there, and there's certainly questions about that. I mean, the Broncos weren't very good last year, so you could certainly point to that, and I don't think it was all Case Keenum. I don't think it was all about him. But, I mean, there are certainly things you can point to about Flacco and have concerns about. I mean, statistically speaking, the yards per attempt has declined pretty rapidly over the last 3 or 4 years. Now, how much of that is Joe? How much of that is the talent around him? We've talked about that at length. We'll continue to talk about that if the Ravens don't do a good job putting talent around Lamar Jackson. For that matter,
and the Broncos are going to have to talk about that all year too, because he needs players, he needs protection, and he's 34 years old and he's not mobile.
But that was going to bring me to my next point. To me, the big question, the big doubt for that I have individually about Flacco, beyond needing to have enough talent around him that you're going to set him up to be successful, is durability. I mean, that has to be a question at this point. It has to be. He missed some significant time with the hip this year. Last year with the back, even though he didn't miss any games, we all know that the first half of the season he was not close to 100%, and his play reflected that.
I think the back is the reason he's gone, right? I mean, the general belief would be back at 34 is not a good thing.
Yeah. I mean,
it's not something we hear about Tom Brady, right?
Right, especially for a 6'6" quarterback who is, and I don't know what Joe's weight is now off the top of my head, but for a guy who is a bigger guy with a back issue, that's not a good thing. I mean, that's something that typically isn't going to completely subside. You can certainly do things to minimize the impact of it, but it's going to be a variable, and I'm sure it's something that he still feels waking up from time to time. It's just like anyone who has a back
50,
issue
dude. I feel
older.
It too.
right. I mean, anyone who has a back issue when you get older, it's something that might not impact you every day, but it's going to be there.
That's why I have Dr. Steve out at the Elliott Chiropractic
Life Center,
as well as I get on the yoga mat. So yeah, I mean,
right. So I mean, there's certainly very fair, very real questions about Joe Flacco, and that's from that standpoint. I'll hear what the Ravens ended up doing and making that. But to go back to your point, as far as early, where they were, Jackson and Flacco in early September, this is why anyone that was in the local media that was out at training camp every single day was just laughing at any notion of there being a real quarterback controversy at that point. First of all, I mean, they're such different quarterbacks. I mean, if you want to talk who's better at this point in time, well, what specifically are you referring to? If you're talking about being purely a pocket passer, then it's Joe Flacco. I think that was obvious even in December. If you're just talking about pocket passing, it was Joe Flacco, even though he was standing on the sideline. But what Lamar Jackson does bring as far as X factors with his playmaking ability, his ability to run, what pressure he puts on the defense from a running game standpoint, and what that does for Gus Edwards and what that's going to do for Mark Ingram now. I mean, those factors are very real. And by the way, those factors shouldn't be viewed as anything that's going to penalize Lamar Jackson. That's part of the package. That's part of the appeal for him. Now, you want to limit the number of hits he's going to take and the number of times he's going to run to some degree, but you don't want to eliminate it because that's part of what makes him who he is. And one of the reasons why the Ravens were able to make the run they did over the final 2 months of the season.
Hey, man, one's like a sports car and one's like a sedan. They can both get you there.
Yeah, I mean, they're different. So which gives you a better chance to win in 2019, which that's what's relevant now? We'll see. I mean, I think one thing, going back to the point you made and the point that I've been a broken record about for years now, is the Ravens didn't show an ability or a willingness or both to build around Joe Flacco. Now, how much of that was the contract? It's part of it. Sure. It's the part of it That's part of it for any high-priced quarterback. But don't tell me there weren't moves they could have made to make their offense around him better, because there were. They chose not to, or they didn't have the ability to. So that's where the question moving forward, what are the Ravens going to do to put Lamar Jackson in the best possible scenario to be successful? And we know that's going to be offensive line. We know the running game is going to remain very, very, it's going to be paramount. But how much passing are you factoring in there? How much play action, shots down the field, which Greg Roman did plenty of that with San Francisco with Colin Kaepernick. They ran the ball a lot, but when they threw it, they did push the ball down the field. And we saw that a little bit at times. We saw that with Mark Andrews in the first Chargers game. So how much does that grow in year two? Year one, in terms of first full season as a starter for Lamar Jackson, it's going to be interesting to see. But to try to compare what those two are, it's hard to say. I mean, I think Lamar Jackson has that special kind of upside as far as being this unique playmaker, but if you're going to ask strictly from a passing standpoint, then yeah, I'll still take Joe Flacco at this point. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that works out. And it's not apples to apples. I mean, you're going to be talking about two different teams now, and two different sets of receivers, two different sets of offensive lines, two different schedules. But I think everyone's going to be here in Baltimore following with interest how Flacco does while watching what progress Lamar Jackson makes. And if these two teams end up facing each other in the playoffs come January, well, that'll be a heck of a lot of fun, and will leave no shortage of storylines for guys like us, that's for sure.
He is Baltimore Luke, out on Twitter, and Luke at WNST.net. All of our WNST coverage brought to you by our friends at King Discount Liquors. Get out, give the King a ring. Don't forget, we got a special bull and oyster roast coming up at the Timonium Fairgrounds on April the 28th. I'll be there all afternoon. My man Victor T will be there, and the liquor board folks, or the liquor association folks, I should say, are associated. So plenty of tasting, plenty of fun, plenty of bowl, plenty of oyster, and some pit turkey as well. Our friends at King Discount Liquors putting that one on. Lottery beer, booze, and the best prices in Baltimore. We'll see you at King Discount Liquors. Also, when the weather gets a little better here this week, get the chill off the air. We had it pretty good over the weekend there. Compass Point Golf is good for you down at Pasadena, 36 holes. And always something going on down there in the putting greens, and easy to find. CompassPointGolf.com, our great sponsor, as I know the players got everybody fired up over the weekend that hits the little white dimpled ball. Also, our friends at Cole Roofing. I'm wearing my Cole Roofing hat right now. They sponsor our community and charity series. I got stuff going on with Believe Big this week. What else do we got? There Goes My Heroes doing something coming up next month as well. We'll be talking more about them. It's all brought to you by Cole Roofing and Gordian Energy. If you haven't learned about the Gordian knot, it's a good time to Google that and learn about that. Since 1919, that's 100 years, Cole Roofing doing it around Baltimore, and proud to be their partner here as well. Proud to have Luke Jones as my partner in Kemo Sabe here as I head off to the NFL owners meetings this week. If you have not read The Big Game, I told my wife this is the week for her to read The Big Game when she's going to be hanging around. You think Bob Kraft's going to be out there getting a foot massage? I'm not sure, Luke, but certainly the owners getting together, the rules this week. We have new Ravens players, new players everywhere. I guess Mike Mayock will be out there in his Raiders gear. I skipped all the pageantry in Indianapolis, but for the Ravens as a franchise, it has been as turnstile as we've ever seen it, right? Like watching Flacco in Denver, Suggs in Arizona, Mosley with the Jets, Weddle with Zadarius. I mean, all these guys going out the door, and then you and I were in the auditorium on Friday, and they signed a Hall of Famer. They signed a running back. They signed the secondary special teams guy over the weekend from Atlanta. I mean, they've added, big boy National Football League veteran players from other places. They've added their own brand of Eric Weddle here this offseason, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly different. I don't know at this point, and look, I mean, they're not playing any games till September anyway, but I can't sit here with full confidence saying the Ravens are better than they were 2 weeks ago when you consider all the player movement, but they certainly have addressed the safety position. I think they've upgraded the safety position. I feel very confident in saying that, assuming Earl Thomas can stay on the field. And I think they're there's some question about that, but the nature of the two injuries he's had in the last 3 seasons, I mean, they've been broken legs. Like, it's just kind of a weird freak type thing. Not, we're not talking groin issues or hamstring issues or things like that. It's been broken bones. I mean, I don't know what the remedy is for that. Drink more milk? I don't know. I mean, it's so... But beyond that, I mean, you're getting a Hall of Fame talent, to your point. I mean, this guy has been the best free safety in the NFL since the end of Ed Reed's career. I mean, that's pretty clear cut. That's pretty much the consensus.
He had an aura about him, didn't he?
Yeah. I mean, you're talking about Earl Thomas.
Swag. I mean, it's almost like he didn't want to smile, but then he finally broke down and smiled a little bit. But he did not want to look happy. I think he wanted the people in Seattle to know he was displeased still, a little bit.
Well,
and pissed off for greatness. I like it,
Right. And some of that is also, that's just his personality. In fact, I was chatting with Wink Martindale. He was in the hallway right outside the media room after the Earl Thomas, Mark Ingram press conference, and we were kind of asking him just, first of all, was he feeling better getting Earl Thomas after losing Mosley, Weddle, Suggs, Za'Darius Smith?
Yeah, he didn't like those press conferences any more than we did.
He kind of just laughed, and he said that last week prior to the Thomas signing, he said his wife was calling him every hour just to see how he was doing, which I thought was just priceless. But the point that he made about Earl Thomas specifically, because some of the media types were saying, well, he certainly isn't as talkative as Eric Weddle from a media standpoint, and Wink's comment was, some dogs don't bark, they just bite, and that was his description of Earl Thomas. And I mean, he's no nonsense in the sense of he might not be the best quote, although I had a chance to briefly introduce myself and wish him congratulations, and he reached out his hand to shake my hand, and was very personable in that moment. But it's clear he's got a chip on his shoulder. There's no doubt that anyone who followed the end of his career in Seattle, he held out all of last preseason in training camp, wanted a new deal. The Seahawks weren't inclined to play ball, and then he got hurt, and he was frustrated and heartbroken and ticked off, and flipped the Seattle sideline the bird.
Well, he was sort of the one guy they never took care of there, right? Like literally, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, you consider what he meant to that organization and what the Legion of Boom in general meant. I mean, Richard Sherman, he kind of had a rough ending to his run in Seattle, but in the case of Earl Thomas, I mean, he was, if not the best player on that defense, he was one of the two best players on that defense when they were at their peak. So he's got something to prove, and certainly when you have anyone who is either cut or, in this case, just the contract was allowed to expire and wasn't really given the new kind of deal that he was looking for, they're always going to be out to prove something. And the Ravens are hoping that Earl Thomas still has some really good football ahead of him. I think he does. Is he going to be the best safety in the NFL? Continue to be moving forward? Well, he's going to be 30 years old, so I think there's some fair question about whether that's going to be the case. But I think it's a pretty safe assumption he should be a pretty significant upgrade from Eric Weddle from an individual play standpoint. And this is a guy who has a reputation for a high football IQ. Now, is it in the same vicinity as Eric Weddle? I would think it's pretty close, and certainly there's going to be some adjusting there as far as what the Ravens do defensively.
Yeah, you're saying, well, I don't want Reed anymore. We'll have Polamalu. Okay, okay. I mean, we'll figure that out, right? I mean, that's kind of, and I don't know that Weddle was at that level or playing at that level anymore, but from an ideological standpoint of having a quarterback on the field, when you're watching Terrell Suggs in a Cardinals press conference and C.J. Mosley at a Jets press conference and Eric Weddle at a I mean, forget the play on the field. You just took the entire soul, alignment, assignment, let alone the technique out of that. But you've taken your quarterbacks off the field. At least they brought a grown-up in. I mean, and I guess that was my point of sitting there with you on Friday. I felt like, oh, okay, these are two guys that, have rings and have been around a little bit. They brought two grown-ups in. I like that.
Sure, yeah. I think, and that was one reason why I even asked Eric DeCosta at one point if specifically, putting aside that Earl Thomas has been a multi-time Pro Bowl player, putting aside that Mark Ingram has been to a couple Pro Bowls, has been successful, and kind of, I think he suffered from a little bit of an Alvin Kamara effect, as I put it in my 12 Ravens Thoughts, WNST.net, late last week, that just because Kamara has become this rock star, I think there was a perception outside of New Orleans and maybe with Ravens fans who, the group that were pining after Le'Veon Bell to look at Ingram and say, that's just an okay signing. And look, I didn't think it was a phenomenal signing, but I think it's a good signing.
Oh, come on, man. You're shopping on two different shelves here if you're talking about a guy that turned down $15 million a year last year and wound up getting 9 or 10 as opposed to a guy with 5, but also more tread on the tire, but also a better guy. I mean, they've brought in sort of this Ben Watson-y sort of sage grown-up to hang out because they got a 22-year-old kid who's posting Instagram videos with his gold chain, driving 105 miles an hour, and putting it on Instagram, and then having a plot. I mean, they need some grown-ups around the team. I mean, they really do, and I don't know, where they are with Ronnie Stanley and with Zeus Jr. and but, the days of the Matt Burks and the Anquan Boldens and, Ray Lewis and Ed Reed on the other side of the ball keeping people in line, they brought some grown-ups in here, and I think that's going to be an important part of what they're trying to do to building a program where they're hoping the next 25 draft picks they find Super Bowl players, pile divers, as Buck would call them, right?
Sure, and that's why I think there was a little bit more of a premium with knowing Mark Ingram's reputation in New Orleans. I mean, just Google Mark Ingram leadership or Mark Ingram locker room presence. And, I mean, there were a couple articles I came across last week from New Orleans reporters talking about how revered, how respected he was in that locker room. And Earl Thomas, you're talking about someone who's been to won a Super Bowl and been to another Super Bowl. So winning pedigree with Thomas and leadership with him on the defensive side of the ball after some of the leaders and veterans they lost watched walk out the door last week. And then on the offensive side of the ball, to your point, knowing that you no longer have Joe Flacco, who was a veteran leader on the offensive side of the ball, knowing that Marshall Yanda's in the final year of his contract, and at this point we don't know if he's going to play beyond 2019. You need some leadership, and now you have to have guys who can play. I mean, leadership only goes so far if a guy can't play anymore. I mean, that's really the truth. So,
well, and that was the question on Weddle, right? Literally.
Sure. Well, yeah.
That was the question on Ed Reed at the end. Right? That's the question on Flacco. They don't think he can play. They love Joe Flacco, the human being, as I did in my Dear Joe Flacco letter. But is he the guy you want? Are these the players you want? And they got younger, but they got a lot more expensive. I mean, they paid Earl Thomas all the money, quite frankly, that Seattle wasn't willing to pay it.
Sure, and I mean it's even hard to say that they really got younger because at the same time you had a mid-20s C.J. Mosley and Zadarius Smith walk out the door, so you lost some youthful production there too. So I mean it's different, and again the Ravens still have some work to do before I'm convinced that they're better or. I mean, you could even say even as good, considering some of what they lost. And I think anytime you change the makeup, and to your point, some of the veteran leadership that they've lost, there's always going to be a question of how you fill in those gaps. And Thomas and Ingram certainly are going to be a big part of that, but you still have a linebacker core that needs an additional piece or two. The pass rush absolutely needs two pieces, I think. Someone to rush from the outside and probably an inside rush type player, whether that's a D tackle, whether that's a linebacker who can slide inside, a D end, whatever it might be. So, they still have a lot of work to do, including on their defense. But in the meantime, they've made their secondary better. I think you and I debated this a little bit late last week. What's more valuable in this day and age, a great secondary or a great pass rush? I'm a little more inclined to say the secondary because of how quickly quarterbacks get rid of the ball in this day and age. It really neutralizes edge rushers. So unless you have an inside pass rush, which Zadarius Smith, losing him, that's going to hurt their inside rush. I think I'd rather have stronger coverage in the back end. You want both, to be very clear. You want both, but I think there is something to be said about the Ravens fortifying, strengthening their secondary, which was a strength last year, but the one area that you could point to in that secondary that you had questions about, certainly moving forward, was Eric Weddle at the safety spot, and Earl Thomas, more youth and higher upside than Eric Weddle has ever had in his very good career. So, this is an exciting addition for the Ravens, and there's still plenty of work to do, but the good news is they still have cap room with which to maneuver. I mean, they still have some moves they can make. I know people have thrown out the name Justin Houston and some other veteran players that are out there, and could the Ravens add another veteran or two? Sure. Do I think they're going to make any other big signings? Well, I don't really know who's out there that would constitute a big signing at this point, but I think they can add another veteran or two and then go into the draft. And keep in mind, they still have Jimmy Smith on this team. At this point, I think it's pretty apparent they'd like to keep him, but if the right opportunity presents itself, whether it's a signing, whether it's another team that comes calling, wanting to acquire him via trade and wanting to give you an attractive asset, whether that's a draft pick, whether that is, a wide receiver, an offensive lineman, whatever it might be, there's always that card the Ravens could play as well. So I think at this point it's looking more likely that Jimmy Smith is going to be back, but I'm still not ready to sign off and just assume he's playing for the Ravens week one. If they can find the right opportunity in terms of a trade, something of that nature with him where maybe Eric DeCosta would be inclined to move him, especially if, let's say, maybe it's draft weekend. If they draft a corner, let's say, that they really like, that they have a second-round grade for, and they get that corner in the third round or the fourth round, are you inclined then to maybe trade Jimmy Smith if another team comes calling with a starting caliber offensive lineman or a starting caliber wide receiver? Maybe. I just think that's something that's there. So they still have some roster flexibility. We've seen the Ravens make some big signings like this in the past. It's not as though the Earl Thomas signing was something that they've never done. I mean, this is the third time in 4 years they've spent some big money on a safety. They did it with Jefferson 2 years ago. They did it with Weddle 3 years ago. So that's not anything out of the blue in terms of the outcome. But the difference is here, after the first and second wave of free agency, they still have some money to spend. And it's not to say that you just spend it just for the sake of it, but there are some opportunities that could come along where the Ravens could still make some moves financially from a free agent standpoint and before they get into the draft.
He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke out on Twitter and Luke at WNST.net. All of our WNST coverage brought to you by our friends at the Lifebridge Health Sports Medicine Institute. This is the week Dr. Kevin Crutchfield comes back from vacay. He's going to be joining us to talk about concussion and head-related injuries, as well as Dr. Craig Bennett, who's taking care of my wife and her orthopedic needs. She's got a little shoulder issue right now, took care of my elbow. That's what happens when you get old like us. Especially my wife, who's a warrior and prepping to run a marathon, half marathon this year. Lifebridge Health Sports Medicine Institute, the new game plan for sports-related injuries. I was out with Cal Ripken last week at the JCC. They're great folks. They're up at Foundry Row in Owings Mills. They are there to take great care of you for all your sports medicine needs. Also, our friends at Freedmont Mortgage. Don't make a 30-year mistake by choosing the wrong lender. You need the right lender. You need Carl Delmont and our friends at Freedmont Mortgage. Learn more about what they're doing at Freedmont.com. Out online. We'll be telling you all about that. Also, if you're in the mood for some crabs, get on down to Costas Inn, see our friends down there. Good enough for the Today Show, my mom, the fat crabs, the cold beer, the pit beef. The legend continues. They got bands down there, too. My buddy Kirk's band played down there last week. Good jazz on Wednesday night. I always try to make my Wednesday nights down there because people don't realize how much I love smooth jazz because I don't talk about it, but I write to it a lot. So any good jazz music comes my way, any Steely Dan. Costas Inn does it on Wednesday nights, but they got the crabs there all the time. I am Nestor. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore. I hope you read my Dear Joe Flacco letter out at WNST.net. And appreciate the support as we head off to the owners' meetings, getting you ready for opening day, getting ready for March Madness this week. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.